Director of the county, also chair of the committee. So we are at, I think, the sixth meeting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, the sixth meeting for this year. So we only have, I think, probably one more or two more to go to wrap up this year's session. So I want to kind of quickly review what we have been done so far, and then we will go to the recommendation discussion. And Steve Pointer, my vice chair, is going to join me as soon as he's ready. So we started meeting in early January, and here are the main topics we have covered so far. If you recall, we started with an overview about last year's Spending Affordability Advisory Committee, including major recommendations there. And then there's a few agencies joined us. It's mostly Health and Human Services type of agencies that briefed us about their services and also the challenges they have in providing those services, especially during the pandemic. Then our public safety agency joined us the following meeting that talked about the body-worn camera in Lance, and also the police chief specifically talk about the highlight that the police department is facing, including their staffing challenges, as well as some crime rates data update there. Then EDA did a very interesting briefing about both the economic situation of the county and also economic development, as well as the grants to activities with the business during the pandemic. And our IT director has provided a briefing about all those services done by our IT, especially during the pandemic, what kind of support they have to elevate in order to enhance and maintain the existing services there and providing some new services there. Then following that, Jeff from our DPZ provided a very interesting informative briefing about the county's long-term trend, demographic, development trends there, and some of are really underlying drivers about the county's long-term economic and revenue outlook. And Dr. Irani provided an economic outlook covering national and regional major economic indicators. And the community college provided a briefing about their budget as well as operating and the CIP needs there. And the following week, two other education entities there, our school system as well as library, provided their outlook. You know, the school actually was on February 4th, but anyway, the community college provided their outlook. Dr. Clinch provided the briefing on especially the county, Maryland, but also the county, with a focus on the labor market, but also touched on other different elements there. And that actually helped inform our income tax projections there. And we also, it was not put here because it's an early plan, but we also delivered an update in collaboration with our colleagues in the school system about the grants we received, both entities received and distributed. That's the grants related to the COVID relief. So that helps supported the county's economic recovery and provided needed assistance either to education or to other needs, including residents, business, and nonprofit that was impacted by the pandemic. Then last week, our school system, the superintendent and his team briefed on the school's operating budget, the superintendent budget, and also there are multi-year projections that's including both blueprint implementation and also other needs. And I presented from the county side very preliminary revenue projections and also multi-year projection, as well as the current update of the fiscal condition, comparing projected resources and the request from all the entities combined for both operating and CIP side. And our colleagues in finance, finance director and his team provided the information on the county's debt situation history, as well as projected debt indicators, showing that some of the debt burden are improving from what we see last year, although in general they're still they're still at a relatively high level or are still increasing, but at a slower pace compared with the same time of last year when we make the projections there. And also, he provides some information regarding the county's credit rating, and we're very pleased that we are remaining AAA, and hopefully, I think we will maintain that status as we are in the process of selling another bond. So with that, we basically finished covering all the major topics planned for this year's session of the committee. So today we will mostly focus on recommendations discussion, and then if we get the chance to finish the recommendations, then there's a placeholder this coming Thursday, 2 days from now. On that one, we may not need it if today we're able to get to most of the recommendations, finish discussion. If that day is not needed, then we probably use the chance to pull. Usually Steve will be the one who chair that, and he's going to pull a small number of the committee, just kind of discuss the writing, because need quite some time to just work on the draft report, and then we bring it back to the bigger team and the whole committee for discussion and feedbacks, and everything's finalized for vote on February the 24th. To refresh your memory, I'll also give you very quick kind of a debriefing, which I already did at the beginning of the session, but just to refresh your memory about last year's report, what are some of the key recommendations? Then we will go to this year's discussion. So last year, on the revenue side, the committee made a recommendation of 2.3% of growth. That's both based on information available at that point. The final county adopted budget is just slightly above that based on more information available at that point. In terms of the debt ceiling, the committee last year recommended 50 million, which is much lower than the historical actual bond authorization. As a result, the county did cut back the bond authorization. So last year adopted budget shows 72.5 million, not as low as 50 million, but nevertheless historically low. And then in terms of multi-year projections there, the committee was recommended 2.2% annual average growth. If you recall, at that point, we're in the middle of the pandemic. There are all kinds of concerning indicators, performance. So there were a lot of concerns at that point. Plus, there are some long-term trend that looks like it's going to slow down the county's revenue growth there, including some of demographic, housing, and development trends that was discussed in length in last year's report. And there's also other recommendations. These are based on what people see are important factors that needs to be considered, or things that is recommended to be considered in the budget development, that including try to reduce the new debt and pause some new capital project, try to prioritize the maintenance needs, as well as to boost our fund balance and kind of continue or improve our multi-year projection. Most of this was already taken into consideration in our budget development in the last year's process there. So that's just a quick wrap up about this year's sessions, as well as last year's highlight of the report. So I will invite Steve Poinett, my vice chair, to join us, and he is going to chair today's discussion about recommendation as well as the report writing. Steve has been with the committee for many years, I think, to go through different administrations there, and has been a very knowledgeable, very instrumental in effort. I want to thank him for his leadership, and I'm going to hand it over to you. So Steve, do you want to run from your screen or want me to continue in the current screen?
Since you've already started, is it okay if you just go ahead and continue?
Okay. So
thanks. And thanks for that, Holly. I appreciate it. Sorry, I'm a few minutes behind. And thanks for the overview of kind of this year's sessions, as well as the discussion on some of the recommendations from last year. The four charges of the committee are on the screen in front of you. Projections related to general fund revenues for the upcoming fiscal year 23, a recommended level of new county debt, the general obligation bonds authorization, and keep in mind that's just a recommendation. Obviously, this whole report is just recommendations to help support those who have to make the decisions. An analysis of the long-term fiscal outlook, including multi-year projections. And in previous years, this is where I think the committee has used the language in the report to talk about, trends that are happening within the economy, both locally and nationally, to kind of support any long-term multi-year projections. And I think some of the language you see is around, just, being cautious about those types of projections. As we've seen in the presentations, the projections for this year are strong given what happened, over the past couple of years with the markets and coming out of the pandemic. Some strong growth is expected, but it's also, our understanding of what's going on, and the reason that we had, a couple economists help us with some kind of macro understanding of kind of the trends to support those multi-year projections. And then there's kind of a catch-all of any other findings and/or recommendations that the committee deems appropriate. This is kind of the wide open area for the committee, so it's going to require everybody on the committee to kind of point out anything that they've seen from any of the presentations, anything that they understand from what's going on in the community, to put recommendations on the table for the committee to discuss. Now the process it'll be a voting process, right? We'll go through a little easier to do when we're all in person, but we'll go through these items here and have a discussion around the kind of what we want to recommend for the committee, from the committee to excuse me, to the county executive in the report, and put that together. So we're gonna go ahead and go through that process. Holly, can you flip to the next slide? So as we look at the process that we've gone through the past few years, and what we expect to do this year, is that we'll go through today's meeting. We'll have a discussion on the items. I will put together a smaller group to write a report, and that's really because I've never been able to write a report with 30 people. It's just a draft. Everything in there is open for discussion and review and comment, with the hope that we'll get this report put together in the next week, for everybody to have a review, so we can have a discussion on the 24th regarding the report, with comments from the whole committee on the items they have. I think this is a pretty open process. It's one that's worked well for the past few years. My first few years in the committee were very closed. It was a very closed process. We had presentations, and then we were given a report, or given recommendations, and we were never given the report to review. So until the very end, and it wasn't really a vote. So I'm trying to create a process that's much more open, that I think was developed a few years ago with previous committee members, and allows for that. Any questions before we get into the considerations for the reports? Okay. So our first charge is, do we support the current revenue forecast for fiscal year 2023? In the presentation that Holly gave last week, that showed us almost $80 million increase, or about 6.6% over the fiscal year 2022 budget. Obviously, she's very close to these numbers, and the members of the staff are very close to these numbers and understand kind of how things are coming in. So I would like to have a discussion from the committee on the support for the potential $80 million increase in fiscal 2023 budget.
If anyone want to talk, yeah, Barbara, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
I'm unmuted. Am I okay now?
You are, Barbara. I can hear you
Good.
loud and clear.
Okay. Well, obviously, I'm thrilled that we have a 6.6% increase, but this is considerably higher over our historical averages. And is this the place where we would make some comment about that? Or do we want to put it further in the report? But I do think that we need to suggest that this isn't something we can go crazy over.
Yeah, I think we can support the number, in my opinion, and the rest of the committee needs to weigh in. But I think we could support the number for 6.6% increase, because that's kind of where the numbers are coming in, and the information that Holly has. But I agree with you that, I don't think I've ever seen an increase of this magnitude. Now, I've been on the committee when most of the time revenues were going, relatively slow growth and flat because of where the economy's been. But I wouldn't want to start budgeting, nearly 7% revenue increases on an annual basis. I think we all talked about the pressures in the economy and what we're going to have with inflation, and how that could impact revenue increases in the short term, in the next few years. But I think we can put some language in there around that, Barbara.
I really do, because I think it can really allow people to have a long leash. And so I would prefer not to have that happen. We've been trying to be so disciplined that I don't want to send an opposite message. Thank you.
No problem. I mean, I agree. I think the county has been trying to be very disciplined in its revenue, use of revenue and spending increases. But as is the case in many years, the spending requests far outpace the revenue projection increases going into the fiscal year anyway. So it's no different there.
This is
Ellen.
I'm going to echo what Barbara said and say I think it's more important than ever that we provide a context for these numbers, that they are really extraordinary based on revenues received from outside sources, not from necessarily reflecting what we've been able to pay off and what we've seen have an impact on growth that's really only immediate and not long term. We have to place a context around this. This is not what we can look forward. This is not business as usual or anything that's sustainable. And so I, absolutely agree with Barbara that that's an important to put the numbers in context. The numbers are what they are, but you have to understand their context.
Thank you. Jennifer Mallow, did you have something that you wanted to say?
I do. Two things. One, I don't know if anybody else is getting this on the share screen.
Yeah, I just noticed it. Like half of it's gone.
Yeah, if somebody could address that, that would be great. And then the other question I kind of have is, Holly, where do you see the greatest, not weakness, but where are you least confident about these projections?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
Great question.
I think that's the income tax, because the performance has been so wild, so volatile, and so different from what the actual economic, no matter it's job growth, wage, or personal income and that. So that one has a lot of uncertainty because its change are so different from the actual economic performance there. And there's also, because of a lot of uncertainty regarding pandemic and economic recovery and the policy, that all going to have an impact on that. So I think it's actually, to that point, I think it's important to point it out that there, and also help people understand uncertainty that continue to feature this year's forecast there.
Holly, on that point, how much of that increase would you say is due to capital gains increases versus normal income tax?
That actually, unfortunately, we don't have that level of data.
Okay.
That there, so, and also even the state, while they don't have that, and they don't
Okay.
put it at a county level, so we can conceptually talk about, but not able to quantify that.
That's fine. I just, if we could, it would make, I think, to the previous question, it would just make things easier to understand that what's repeatable and or potentially, and what's, you know, not kind of built into the revenue, to the long-term revenue. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I have a follow-up question.
Okay, go ahead.
And that is, where do you feel most confident about these projections?
No, this least confident. I think you.
No, she's asking another question, which
I'm
is
asking
where
a
do you
second
feel the
question.
most confident?
You gave me what you felt least confident about. Now I want to know, what do you feel most confident about that this is a slam dunk?
Got it. So the most confident, I think, it's assessment and property tax base, because two reasons. One is the state provided official data, so that's and they're the one who assessed the base, so they should know what they're talking about, because they did the research and they did the actual assessment. So these numbers are projection, but largely based on what they have done so far. The other reason is that assessment doesn't change double digit from 1 year to year. It's very stable, and partly because the reason that Maryland have a 3-year phasing, and 1/3 will probably get reassessed there. So usually this one doesn't swing too much and not off much. It's usually very, very close to actual. But I would say income tax, even historically, have been more volatile than other revenue types there, but particularly in such an economic situation.
And then my third and final question is, last year, I think you threw up on that first slide that this committee projected 2.2 growth.
2.3.
2.3 with an actual of 2.9. What do we have in terms of historical data, a little bit longer than just last year, of here's what was recommended versus here's what was actual?
That's the budget, the fiscal 22 budget. So what is the county budgeted versus what's the committee recommended? That's pretty easy to pull. I'll pull prior year's recommendation versus county adopted budget. There's about 2 months apart, so there was more data usually get coming. Primarily, it's usually based on year-to-date data, because we have more information on income tax and plus some other fees coming in, and we have a better idea, depending on the General Assembly's decision on some of the state aid as well, which is small in the total general fund, but we also factor in. So when the county executive developed his or her budget in April, those additional information get captured in. But usually there's not significant difference. There are marginal difference between the SAAC report, use the data, versus what's captured in the executive's data. Yeah.
So this is coming down to another, I mean, it's a great question, because we've tried to look at that from a lot of different pieces of where information is coming from, but this committee is trying to put a report together with incomplete data, and it happens every year.
Right.
And because of the timing of what I guess the charter requires of this to be completed and turned into the county executive, we continue to run up against the fact that if this was due in the middle of April, we'd have a much better picture of when of what revenues were going to be for this year.
Right. But the timing also, I think, is carefully thought, because there are some other jurisdictions that the committee deliver report even earlier than that. The part of the reason is we do need a preliminary.
So they're less wrong.
We can start to build budget upon, and then make some adjustment, right? You cannot wait for last minute because once you know, you run out of time to make
Sorry.
allocation.
Holly, you don't need to defend it. It is what it is. We have to, I just felt I had to make that statement, is that we continue to run into the fact that
Yeah, you
we
wouldn't.
don't have, I mean, it happened last week when we were asking questions around some of the things, and I know the school system and the school board have to, they don't know. There's things that they don't know, and they're not going to find out for another, few weeks, month and a half until things come out of the state. And we're all trying to get these things done now because of our timelines to get particular things approved. So
Yeah.
I think, being off by 0.5%, and I remember a few years ago, the committee, the report was, when I was presenting to the county council, that was a couple of items. Were a couple of things that the county council focused on, is that the number in the report was wrong, but you have to understand that it's based on the information that's available at the time the report is written. So
maybe not for this year, but for future years, it might be helpful to have like a confidence rating based on analysis of past projections and actuals, like projections to actuals, saying, yeah, we consistently got this right, or because of the timing, we consistently got this almost right or really far off.
I mean, that would be great if this were a statistical measurement, but it's not. It's because it's got so many other variables in there, but I'll let somebody who's a lot smarter than me explain that. But it's a good point. It's a good point that it's not always accurate.
This is Andreessen. Is this 6.6 conservative? We talked about the areas where you're confident and the areas where you're less confident in the numbers. Is this a conservative number, or, what would that range be? If you were to be conservative, what might that look like?
So usually the approach, so I'll talk about the general approach and my personal take on that. Usually I stay with more in the middle range, not at too far in the spectrum from most conservative to the most aggressive, but in the middle range, but more lean towards conservative. So I'm not most conservative. I didn't intentionally try to do it, but also I don't want to be aggressive. But I do lean a little bit towards conservative. But that's based on based on information available, what we know, we try to do. But in reality, as I think Steve was pointed out, that forecast business itself is just it's extremely tricky because there are so many factors impact that, and sometimes it's not even what you get right or wrong. It's how do you guess out what federal government is going to do? How do you guess out to the consumer behavior? How do you guess out to the state over distribute, under distribute income tax? Because all those things, their own behavior, their own decision there, it's not even always match economic reality. Those other factors, you cannot. So it's not necessarily sometimes, oh yeah, why last year, why didn't we?
Yeah.
But to this point, to all of these questions, Holly,
right? Yeah.
the discussion right now with your team and the county executive is to most likely present a budget that has about an $80 million revenue increase.
Yeah.
That's where you are right now.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Todd, did you have a question?
Yeah, if I can just jump in a second. I guess I'm less concerned about whether we're right on at 6.6 or at 6.8 or at 6.3. It's more a question, I think, for both Holly and Dr. Clinch. Is the 6.6% number borrowing from future growth, or are we looking that we'll just revert to the norm of 2 to 3% going forward, or are we looking at sub 2% growth going forward because we stole some of future growth in this current year?
Now you're skipping to the next question. 2 questions away.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Dr. Clinch.
Well, then I'll withhold it for then.
No, that's all right.
I mean, there's really no issue of kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul with revenue forecasting. So I don't have the county's revenue long-term in front of me, but I do have personal income. So, I mean, first and foremost, revenue forecasting is lagging, right? The economy, because we're getting money from the state as it's collected months after it's collected. So by the time an economic event, a recession or growth impacts, the economy, the revenues go to the state lagging that, and then go to the counties lagging that. So our revenues are always lagged. So that's why there's huge variance in what happens as this lagging impact. And as Hallie talked about, nobody, smarter people than me or have tried to forecast capital gains. And that's going to factor in, I think, this year that there are going to be capital gains in that, and nobody can really forecast what capital gains are. So the reason, we kind of lagged this, and then I went back kind of in a personal income and looked at what happened after the last recession. And so we had revenue growth, not revenue growth, personal income growth in the county of 8% in 2011. Yes, the incomes that are taxed. 2 years after the 2009 recession for that lagging impact. But then we regressed to the mean of 4% the next year, and then we had negative personal income growth, not revenue growth, the year after that. So again, these bubbles kind of pass through the economy. So what we have here is we had a recession. The recession didn't impact revenues as much because it was huge government stimulus to offset the revenue losses at the individual level, which were then taxed. So, as we've talked about, the revenue forecast is probably higher than the norm because of where we are in the recovery, and will regress towards the mean of 3 to 4% in the long run after that, in my opinion, for what that's worth, as to kind of A, why it's volatile, and B, it's not robbing, it's experience. When do you experience the revenue? When do you book it?
Well, depend. Well, so Dr. Clinch, I think I agree with you. But from one thing I will add to that, and this is something that probably, I don't know if this is coming up in any of the discussions that you're having, Holly, with the state, where you're getting some of your revenue projections, and Todd, I don't know if you're talking about this, but in the fourth quarter of 21, there was a significant spike in business sales of people who, and this is what we experienced at the bank, people who were concerned about the tax rates changing in 22 and took advantage of the 2021 tax rates to sell their business and pay taxes on a lower amount. And so that spike that happened in the fourth quarter could cause this projection to be short. I mean, this number could, I'm just saying that this number could be significantly lower because of information that nobody knows right now, and people aren't going to understand until they start calculating receipts from the first and second quarters into the counties and sending them. So, that could potentially pull increases out of future years because those businesses are no longer owned by people in the county, but those are, I don't know what the long run impact would have on that, but I'm just saying that there's a lot that happened at the end of 22 or 21 because of the discussions around tax increases that were potentially going to happen in 22 that caused people to make, financial decisions that could have an impact on the fiscal 23 budget. Does that make sense?
Yeah, not only does it strikes close to home because I'm in that same category.
Yeah.
As you know.
So not only business sales, but also capital gains. So this number, Jen, to go back to your comment, it wouldn't surprise me if this number's off by, forget a percentage increase, but a large dollar increase just because of that kind of fur in the sales atmosphere. When we got to a point where we were in the middle of December and we're like, we can't process these things in the next 2 weeks, given everything that's happening. Things can't happen. So anyway.
Holly, if I missed it, I apologize, but of that 6.6%, are you able to break it into those categories of property tax, income tax, and other?
Yeah, actually, there's a slide on that.
You want to pull that slide up real quick, Holly, if you could?
Yeah, and also, by the way, just to clarify a little bit, this is 6.6% budget to budget, but as we just talked about, because 21 is surprised everybody in a positive way, that part of that carried through FY 22. So 22 estimate level is going to be higher than original budget. So if you compare to the estimate to 23, it's roughly half of that is acknowledged the base getting higher.
So wait. You're saying a lot of words there, Holly, and let's slow that down a little bit. What you're saying is not ignore, but the 6.6 is budget to budget, but the
Correct.
actual budget to actual is more in the 3.5% range.
Yes. So
Okay.
that's what I was trying to say, because, and part of the reason is acknowledge the base, because whenever
I get what you're saying. I think it's important for the committee to understand that what you're telling us is that the actual increased because of other funds coming in, but
Correct.
of the 80 million, most of the increase is coming from our standard revenue sources, not stimulus sources that drove some of the 2022 increase.
Right.
And if everybody remembers the discussion around real property taxes, that's been a very stable source of revenue for the county for a long time. And when the income tax numbers were dropping during the Great Recession, we were still seeing some level of growth in real estate taxes because the base was so high. Even when they came down, there was still increases. Like, you know, if you understand what I'm saying, like people may have had like a 30% property value above their assessment because the assessments are capped at a certain level every year. And even when the market value came down 25%, they still had increases because they were so below their assessments and that adjustment from their tax base. So those are things that kind of helped us through the Great Recession. That number isn't as big as it was, but with property values growing at a rapid rate again, you know, I think we're seeing some of that gap come back for us. So that's always been a relatively stable source of revenue compared to the income tax, which can be a little more choppy.
There it is.
And thank you, Steve. I think you explained very well. And here's the table. I think, Todd, I assume you were talking about this one, right? The breakdown of different components there.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
also have a note here, the total revenue growth versus 22 estimate level is only about half of the total budget to budget growth there. So because the current year base, including, you know, everything, it was actually higher than what's the original budget because of the spillover of the base increase there.
So most of this increase is coming from projected income tax increases.
Right. And here, like, to refresh our memory about income tax, there we did have spikes in fiscal 20 and 21, but in the forecast I have currently, we're assuming that's going to have a correction FY 22, which year to date already experienced, but we assume that would reflect in overall 22 performance as well. Due to the reason we talk about, there's a lot of one-time factors, so we think it's not going to sustain that level of growth, and also the lagged impact, as Dr. Clencher was alluding. Then we kind of go back a little bit more towards more normal growth there.
If somebody sold their business in November or December,
yeah,
right, you would know about that from a tax receipt standpoint until the third quarter, correct?
Right, and that's tricky because depending on when people reported that and how that was get acknowledged, there some will be in the current year, some will be the next.
No, but I'm saying that what I was trying to point out there's a lag between when somebody pays a tax and when the county receives the tax.
Yeah, and also not to try to complicate it even more is that this is not the only like a temporarily shift between years, because 2020. Calendar year 2020, there was also some one-time factors. We heard that it looks like there's one pay period, then others somehow get captured in that year by a lot of business, not all of them. But again, the state cannot say how many, but they said there are quite some business somehow just because of cutoff date, there are some that. And there's other legislative change at state level that actually provide incentive for people to move 2021 to 2020. So there's a lot of shifting around. That's what I say, the consumer behavior incentivized by different legislative change combined with other one-time temporary measure like federal stimulus package, then compounded with the governor's decision of, oh, you already get withholding from unemployment insurance, but now we decide not to tax you, so we'll have to go through refund, and that's still going through the process as well. So there are multiple.
Maybe we should just say that we will never increase the budget revenue more than like 2.5%. And then we don't have to worry about all these other things, and we'll stick everything else in rainy day funding.
Good luck.
Yeah, we can recommend anything we want, but
I don't think that anybody on the committee is going to vote for it. I was just saying, it's like, I think we're trying to create science where there's not really science.
Holly, there's about a 3-month lag between when the state, so capital gains experienced in the fourth quarter of 2021 would be received by the state in the second to third quarter, so dispersed to us in the third to fourth quarter. Do I have that timing halfway right?
If they reported estimate in time, or they file the income tax in time, but you know, they have extended.
No, but Holly, I guess what he's saying is from the time let's say from the time it's reported to the time it's received is 2 quarters.
At a minimum. And then there's also
the time it's reported, not the time that it happened, but from the time it's reported to the time the county receives it is about 2 quarters.
At a minimum, and then
it could be much longer than that, because
it could, but it's on average is probably better to say it's not going to happen in 3 months.
Correct. It will never. And then Holly, doesn't there a certain amount of smoothing going on that if Howard County has a very high rate, say compared to Queen Anne's County, of these types of one-time revenues, those are also smooth. The state doesn't change its allocation formulas that it gives disperses the money to the counties.
This is as muddy as it could be. So a couple of things. One, about the timing. The timing is unpredictable because, Steve, to your point, there's a lag, at least by a few months, but many are more than that because people can file in November and some delayed to next year's January for what they gained a year ago. And there's a lot of people doing that actually, and that's how many people doing that also swing from year to year. Some years you suddenly have a spike because more people choose to delay that, and there are other years that people choose to file in time. So that crossed at least 2 this fiscal year. And then there's also reconciliation from the state side. The state doesn't know exactly each county's share in their overall pie. The pie they collected keeps changing because consumers' behavior, but the allocation by county, they will use a lagged factor to assume how much percentage. And then sometimes they overshoot it that year and sometimes they under. So then they use the following 2 years to catch up. So typically everything goes perfect. Consumer doesn't change behavior. There's no capital gains. Everything else is stable. We could sometimes be 3 or 4% higher or lower than what's the actual performance, and then the state will compensate us in the following 1 or 2 years by, okay, if last year they over distribute, they will try to under distribute the following to make up for that. And if they do the opposite, they will do it the other way. And then that's the part that's very, very difficult to guess because they are using lagging impact. If we are recovering faster this year than others, then our distribution doesn't reflect that. Then they will use the following year to catch up. But if we lower than everybody else there, we get still our normal share. Then next year they will actually take it back by lowering our distribution. So there are all those factors plus the consumer behavior, etc. What I would say, year to year, it's extremely difficult to try to get it right because you cannot guess all those different behaviors. What are they going to do? And they're the one who determine the actual performance. If you look at the bottom line, like you 3-year, 5-year average, then the actual income performance not that far off from the economy. As we talk about the 3-year, 5-year average before the pandemic, the income tax and the actual personal income on average, they're very close. But in any given year, that could be easily 3 or 4% higher or lower because of those timing and different players' decision. And it's really almost not possible to predict in advance there. So we
So
try
I'm
to
just trying to get
So,
at,
so we've asked a committee of people to try to come up with a prediction with not having all the data.
yeah.
but your capital gains bubble will be digested by the county's economy in fiscal 2023, realistically.
That is my assumption at this point. The up and down, that's beyond the normal base. I was assuming that's through the correction and following the spike will largely get corrected. 23 kind of like moderately go back to the historical trend. Then beyond FY23, more go back to close to actual income growth there. That's my current assumption. But the spread between those different years, 22, 23, it's kind of hard to tell. It could be 22 at a better, but 23 slightly lower. But like, but in general,
Okay, Holly.
that's what I was thinking.
It makes sense. And thank you, Dr. Clinch. We're spending a lot of time on this, and it's a very important topic. But and now I'm going to go back to Todd's question from a few minutes ago, which is if this is truly just a bump because of capital gains, why are you so confident in on the long run that you've put forth, which is like 3.3 to 3.4%? I mean, isn't there a chance that next year, because we're growing so much this year, that next year could be flat?
Okay, I was
Because
not
basically what you're saying was 3.5%, that we're going to be $100 million over fiscal year 2021 budget in
no.
fiscal year in 24.
Okay, so this is income tax. So let's just focus on income tax there. I was assuming 22 is lower than FY 2021 level. I was assuming a correction happening in 2022 from the 2021 actual level.
No, I'm talking about 2023 to 2024, Holly.
Right.
Your
Right, and
2023 budget estimates $42 million increase in income tax revenue.
From the
So,
budgeted level. That's from the budget level. So from the
okay, but okay, I get it. I understand that. From whatever the budget level, but a portion of what came in 2022 and a portion of what's going to come in 2023 is going to be capital gains taxes because of the market spiked last year, post pandemic. People are selling businesses right now. So let's just say that subsides to normal levels of growth. We're putting in an increase that could go down in 2024, but your long range projection has us going up in 2024, so that we're going to be over budget levels of about $100 to $110 million in 2024 from fiscal year 2022. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying?
I think we're still, I mean, again, I wouldn't say I'm confident, right, about my income tax projection because of all the unknowns there. But I believe, it's my personal belief, I believe between 22 and 23, we largely finished the corrections there. I don't think there are too much left for future years after that, beyond the normal state allocations between counties there. They could still get it around between year to year.
I think my fear, and I'd like to hear if anybody else in the committee has this as well, is that if $80 million increase is approved, that now becomes a base of spending, right? We've shown as a community, we're not in the cut spending world, we're in the increased revenue world, or maintain spending world, unless an emergency happens. So if we're going to put in $80 million into our base, do we believe we can not only sustain that $80 million, but we can grow from there in future years? Because that's question number 2 or 3 of the 3 questions that we have to go. So I want to hear from the rest of the committee on this.
Yeah, Steve, that's kind of exactly the point of my question, because it seems to me that given that on a net basis over a 2 or 3 year period, the economy hasn't grown in fact, it's shrunk, but personal income has gone up. So the question is, what's driving that? And is it capital gains? Is it 401k and IRA early distributions? It's not because of the county's employment. In fact, we're looking at employment still being below historical averages. So,
Right.
what explains it? And it seems to me that this has to be a one-time thing. I don't see how it cannot be a one-time thing. And it's a one-time thing that may in fact be compromising our ability to grow at historical averages if it's from people selling stocks so they're getting capital gains. They have less than to sell in the future and less capital gains to capture in the future. If they're redeeming IRAs and 401ks early, again, they have less ability to capture that in the future, and our income taxes go down in the future. So that's really the cause for my concern looking forward, is that I don't see how you explain a 10% growth in income taxes based on the performance of the economy, because it's not there.
Well, but I think, Todd, the other piece that we're not talking about is that wage pressures is upon us, and that is going to create increases in income tax, even without growth in jobs.
Yep.
Right. My question is are we going to see? We're looking at $21 million increase, which is, 4% increase over the previous year in income tax. If I'm doing my math in my head right, I could be doing it wrong, but I guess that's my question. Dr. Ronnie, Dr. Clinch, anything you want to add to that? And then we'll move on to the next question. I just don't think we've solved this one yet, but we'll try to get through a couple other questions today.
Well, I'll close out my comments real quick. The 6.6 for the current year, that's based on Holly's best estimate of what's actually happening. So I'm perfectly comfortable with Holly's estimates in that regard. My concern is more looking forward and how a 6.6% increase this year influences the council and the executive to act that will lock us into a new baseline that really hurts us going forward.
Yeah.
This is Richard. I completely agree that revenue and expenditure we can talk about, and I think that's how this all started when Barb was the first person to bring up the fact that we don't want to open the doors to the candy store or promote. So I think we can make our revenue and expenditure forecasts. We can talk like we talked about that. Just because it's growing, we think it's going to regress to the mean, like Holly's forecast does. And then I'll say I completely agree with you, Steve, that there's going to be a wage impact in the coming months and year. However, that also has an offsetting expenditure impact. So on the net, because Howard County is I can't remember the exact number, 5th, 6th highest income county in America, will slightly do better than our revenue. With wage growth, we should get more revenue than expense growth, but it is more or less offsetting.
Okay.
That's a good point.
Thank you.
I concur with my colleague. We're going to get some pay raises, but it's not going to be enough to offset the growth and expenditures. It might be a wash.
Yeah, and well, that's what I think, Dr. Ronnie. That's what I'm trying to say is like it's one thing if it's a wash. It's another thing if suddenly we've baked in huge expense. Like if we go through the budget process and suddenly there's this, oh, well, it's going to be 80 million, but there's these other things. So maybe it's going to be 100 million. And then we go into next year and we're like, well, wait, it was 100 million, but next year it's only going to be, and then suddenly we're at this new higher base of expenditure. And then we're looking at cuts. And yes, it's great that we have these increases from a revenue standpoint. It'll allow us to solve some things, and I feel like we begin to become the committee of hey, everybody be cautious, because there's always room for that caution of let's just not spend everything because we don't know what tomorrow brings.
I agree. I think there's obviously the fund balance needs to be recharged. So there's some opportunity to take that one-time increase and put it to good use versus increasing the base spending. So I think I'm in agreement with everybody that, yeah, this is great news, but it should be basically balanced at the traditional growth of around the mean, because otherwise, as you said, Steve, we could end up overspending and having to make cuts next year.
Okay, thank you. Any more comments on the 6.6%?
Yes, I just want to say that I appreciate a deeper dive into this, because I definitely don't want to give the council or other departments a long leash on this extra money. So that's just my final comment.
Anybody else have anything that they want to add?
Yeah, this is Josh. I agree with what Dr. Rani said. We're looking at something that it's essentially like a Christmas bonus. And if we don't come out strongly that this is the time to kind of patch the roof while the sun is shining, we will fail in our ability to really advise the county, because when you have positive long-term or positive factors here, like a strong housing market, we don't know if a 4 or 5 interest rate hikes this year will pop that bubble. There's a lot of things that are going to be offsetting in the years to come. We heard about what our commercial based real estate looks like. There's just so much that we don't know. And coming out of COVID, which is nobody could have predicted that coming out of COVID, we'd be in a stronger position. So it's time to recharge the fund balance. And, giving the council a leash isn't necessarily a bad thing if what they spend it on is only for one-time things, or to make sure the rainy day budget the rainy day fund is fully balanced.
Thank you. Very good. Okay. Well, I think we talked about it a little bit. I'm going to bump the bond authorization recommendation and just try to get a sense from the committee. Can you go to the next page, Holly? Just kind of get a sense from the committee where they are on the multi-year projections. And what I'm getting from everyone in the conversation we've had so far is kind of a return to the mean of that 3 to 3.4% range. What did we put in the report last year? Did we say 2.5 to 3 for long-term budgeting purposes?
0.2. Last year,
3.2.
2.5. The committee decided to just take down a little bit, just because there's a lot of uncertainties. We're in pandemic, so that was recommended as 2.2 on average.
Yeah, and I think that, and if I remember correctly, during the council debrief last year, that discussion around the lower run percentage increase came up, and really what I think the stance that the committee took. Now, this is obviously a different committee, but the committee last year took was what Holly just said, which is these long run projections fuel long run projections for other areas within the county, and it's better to be conservative in those than not, and adjust as numbers come in higher. But we've heard from a number of people, but there are some people in the committee who haven't spoken about where they feel on the long run projections in that low 3% range. Okay, I guess everybody's good with that. All right, so then we'll move into the bond recommendations. Holly, can you pull up the slide from do you have the one on the level of requests that are coming in this year?
Hey, Steve, can I just make one quick comment?
Sure, Craig.
Obviously, I don't make recommendations or anything, but I do want to clarify something because of a couple of comments I just heard.
It's going to be
The
about
county
fund balance.
council don't get to choose where the money is spent. It's the county executive. So I've made this clarification before. I just want to make it again. So when the county executive takes this report and he makes the recommendation to the county council can't do much with it. So all they can really do is give it to the schools up to a point that the schools ask, or they can put it into contingency. So really, your recommendations are going to the county executive, not so much to the county council, because he's the one that puts the budget together.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification, Craig.
Right. Thank you.
But they do vote for it. Okay. Holly, can you pull up the not this one here? Do you have the slide that shows what the current requests are coming in right now from the debt presentation that we had, the capital presentation we had? How much is asked for in capital spending so far for fiscal year 23? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Now, I think, are you talking about the request for FY23
Yeah.
total?
Yeah. It's like 100, isn't it like 129 million or something, or 130 million?
I think I have something. Hold on 1 minute. This is last year. Give me 1 minute. Try to find it. Can you see that? It's FY22 request received is the request 87.5 million for
Okay, good.
23, and then the average for the future is 95. So it does come down from last year is about 117 people were asking for. Currently, accumulated request preliminary was 87.5 million.
Okay. All right. So right now the cumulative requests are 87.5 million.
Right.
We're
23.
we are tasked with putting forth a recommendation for general obligation bond issuance or approval, or not issuance, because issuance is different than approval, but additional debt to add to the overall debt. I just threw some numbers on here as like not recommendations, but just to get thought going for the team. Last year the number was how much, Holly? 70 million, 65. You're on mute.
Sorry. Last year, the approved is 72.5, and the committee recommended was 50 last year.
50. Okay. All right. Very good. Do we have any recommendations from the committee on authorization, bond authorization? If not, I always throw out my traditional 0.
I think Barbara wanted to talk.
We can hear from other people what number we want to put in the report.
Well, first of all, I'd love to hear for some of our new people, but one of the things that we've recognized every single year is that even though we put in a low figure, it's always considerably more that are authorized issues, whichever word we want to use here. So I'm going somewhere between 50 and 65, knowing that with this increase in our revenue, there's going to be the temptation to step out further than what we might like.
I would agree with that, Barbara. I was thinking more of a stay the course number, because of the increase in revenue, obviously, but also because we're trending in the right direction with kind of a more constrained bonding, and they've been following the executive's been following our recommendations. So let's try as much to stay the course.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, Steve Hunt here. If I remember correctly, we're looking at the CIP planning in the out years. I think the assumption was under like 75 million going forward, and I thought that kept our numbers in pretty good shape as far as debt ratio, et cetera.
Yeah, the debt modeling that finance was using in discussion with me was that we were using 75 million assumption for the
Right.
next couple of years, and then go back to the historically used 90 million, but we brought it down to 75 next couple of years.
Right.
in
And I believe
assumption.
at 75, all the measures stayed, below where we, want them to be or need them to be. So just wanted to throw that out there that number seemed to work. And to me, that sounds like a cap. So, I'd almost recommend throwing 80 out because, that would throw things off based on the modeling that we saw. We could obviously go lower than that, but that seems to me to be the highest number we could go with, looking at the numbers as far as how that affects debt.
And Holly, does that $75 million, when you run that does that look into the operating costs associated with anything put into place with the 75 million, or does it only look at the debt service associated with that?
The
is on. So Holly, if you want me to speak to that?
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that only speaks to the debt service associated. We don't
Okay.
add the operating costs into it.
Very good. So we don't spend money and not do anything with those facilities or things that we put in place, right? We don't just build empty buildings, we fill them with things. So there's going to be some costs associated with that. How much is the debt service on 75 million under our model? Because we're using 4.5%, right?
Do you mind to just keep talking? Let me bring out the debt model. I can do it quickly.
I wasn't going to do the calculation in my head. I gave up on doing that a long time ago.
Yeah, Steve, yeah, you're right on the 4.5%. Actually, that's an interesting point because it came up in the council presentation last year, where I think it was Council Member Youngman asked the question, what are the assumptions behind the calculations and the ratios of debt service to revenues? And
I'm
that's
always
where,
comfortable using a higher number.
no, yeah, me too. I'm not advocating for more, but I am advocating for clarity and disclosure with respect to how we're calculating that percentage. Because if we're using a 4.5% rate and our historical average over a 10 or a 20-year period is 3%, then we're overstating what our debt service is in our projections. Unless there's reason to believe that we'll be paying 4.5% going forward, which that's hard to imagine if we maintain our AAA rating that we'd be anywhere near 4.5. So I guess my point is that if that question were to come up again this year, I think the council members would be well within their rights to say, well, why are you using a 4.5% rate when the county hasn't paid 4.5% since 1997? Pick a number. I think we have to be a little cautious about overplaying our hand in this regard, and make sure that we're very clear on exactly why we're using the numbers we're using.
No, I understand, but I also think the piece that we miss on a lot of this is that we don't put in the operating costs associated with debt.
Oh, yeah, obviously.
And so
Absolutely.
that if we're off by 1% on the debt service, that doesn't even take into account what the operating costs are for it.
But ultimately, that's not what the rating agencies use when they're looking at the ratio. They're using that as a metric to determine how it impacts impacts our bond rating.
Yeah.
Steve,
Yes.
it's Ellen. I just want to remind everybody also that as came forward during the HOCO by Design sessions, the initial capital expenditure on a new build, okay, only accounts for about 45% of the ultimate capital cost of that project. It covers the initial construction and the outfitting of it. And another 50% increase over that will be spent over the life of that building or project or whatever it is because of necessary systemic renovations and things like that. So we have to keep in mind that that initial cost is not the full burden on the county
I get
in
it.
terms of capital
But
obligation.
that's just the schools,
Well, it's not, it
right?
oops.
Did you go on mute? You're on mute, Ellen.
Somebody's trying to tell me something by muting me.
It's not me.
It does apply to other projects, not every project, but certainly to roads or large facilities like a jail or, you know, things like that. So in the same way, we just need to balance what the increase is on operating, which can put us over, and what the additional capital costs will be related to that project. Plus projects that we have existing that are going to need those systemic renovations as we move forward. So the initial year is just a, you know, a time capsule kind of thing. We have to think beyond that in terms of the impact on a multiple levels.
Okay, very good. So I just did some quick math. It's about $4.5 million a year on 75 million, and if it was at 2.5%, Todd, it would be about $1 million less.
I think it's actually slightly that less than I just did it like a
I'm just doing quick math.
700,000, something like this. 700,000 if we drop from 4.5 to 3%.
Yeah.
But Ted, I think to your point that in the long term, it does cumulatively make a difference. But when it's spread, because we have 20-year debt, any single year is less than $1 million, like several $100,000.
Okay.
Building on Todd's point or I don't know the answer to this, but is it worthwhile thinking about this as this could possibly be the last year that we're in a low interest rate environment?
I mean, what's your definition of low interest rate for bond issuance?
Well, where it's might matter in the, you know, a few $1 million extra a year to carry the bonds if we do borrowing, if there is borrowing that happens in 2024 as opposed to 2023.
I mean, we'd have to go, I think our borrowing rate, we just did the quick math real quick.
Right.
Our borrowing rate would have to go up almost 300 basis points for it to cost us about $1 million a year. So
Okay.
That's a big number, but it's not. I mean,
Okay.
I think people have gotten used. I think people have gotten
around
used.
here, it's fine.
No. I mean, it goes back to a comment earlier. I mean, I think people have gotten used to low rates, but you know, the housing market boomed in this community when the rates were in the 6 to 7% range for mortgages as well. So it's, you know, we have no supply right now, and all kinds of things driving these different numbers we're seeing. But I agree with you that we could see an increase in rates, but I think we just figured out that, you know, that cost isn't as big as it could be. So, but I only have heard one recommendation, and that's from Steve Hunt of $80 million. Did anybody else say anything?
This is Jennifer Mallow. I'm happy to piggyback on Steve's recommendation, and that is particularly with the needs of the school system. In this funding area, I think they're moderately intense, and we historically have been leaving money on the table from the state because we haven't been able to access a county-based match. So when we're looking at kind of comprehensive, getting the most bang for your buck investment, I think given that last year we were projecting out 75 million as a place to be for this year, and given the state of growth that we have seen, I think we can support 80 million, and we probably should be, because it's a prudent investment at this point.
Steve, to be clear, I didn't recommend 80. I actually recommended 75.
Oh, okay. I thought you said 80.
No, I said throw out the 80 because that seemed to be above.
Oh, I thought you were saying I'm throwing out 80. Like here, 80.
No.
Got it.
I was throwing out 80 because 75 and looking at the out year projections as far as debt service, 75 seemed to work since that was the number that was used in the modeling. So I'm actually throwing out a fourth number as I don't know that we could go past that without having a negative effect on some of the other measures with respect to debt.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I'm sorry for misunderstanding. So it's 75 million from Steve. Jennifer, are you supportive of that?
I'd prefer 80, but I can't
I'd like 0. So we're all,
well, exactly. So, I'll see Steve's 75 and raise it 5.
Do we have any other?
I'd go 65 just because I recognize that there has been growth, but I do think this growth is probably ephemeral, and there's so many unknowns from the housing market to the commercial real estate market to everything else. I think it would be to get back on the path of raising the bond authorization is dangerous, and I wouldn't want to go more than 65.
I started out between 50 and 65, and I would go 65. I can't go much higher than that, just for a lot of the
So the
reasons.
first second I have is on 65. So I can hold a vote on 65. I didn't get a second on 75.
I'll second on this is Richard. I'll second on 75 because I think that when the long-term projections were based on 75, showing us doing okay based on the criteria for the AAA bond rating. So I'll second.
Okay. So first and second on 75.
Quick question. I need to back up half a step. Holly, one of the things we've recommended in the past, I know strongly last year, was the issue that Steve raised, and that's the operating costs associated with capital projects. Are we doing that now?
Yes.
When capital projects are being presented,
Yes.
are we reviewing the operating costs?
Yes, we actually even internally asked everybody to provide our, based on the capital projection, what is related to operating costs associated with that. That's obvious multi-year projection for the operating budget is not a budget, just internal exercise, but we asked everybody for that information.
Right.
I think most entity provide that information, probably with exception of the school system, because historically that hasn't been. They're doing much more, just as I mentioned, that internal multi-year projection, but haven't specifically talked about, I think, operating budget impact for capital. But all the county agencies, and also I think at other education entities, we asked them and try to factor in that information. So we did, like in the multi-year projection, you see that information was already captured based on assume the capital project time.
But to go back to that, Todd, it's not in the, when we say the 75 million is modeled, that 75 million that's modeled is only using debt service. It's not using the other piece.
I understand, but I'm going back to like some of the unfilled positions associated with prior capital spending, and you had positions in recreation and parks, for instance, that were going unfilled, and we couldn't even staff our existing operations, and we were pursuing additional capital spending for additional assets that would require, again, more staffing, even though we weren't staffing our current assets. So that's the follow-up question. Are we staffing all of our current assets now, or are we just adding more assets and we still are understaffed in our existing assets?
Okay, so that's a really good question there. What happens is historically, I think we're still playing catching up to answer you that. You're absolutely right. I mean, historically, there were years that there was a lot of funding was appropriated or debt borrowed there, and an agency when was planning operating budget that not everything was budgeted or not funded there. So Rackham Park is a good example that they are still playing catching up because there are certain needs there. Historically, when new projects started, expanded, they were not given the adequate funding in the operating budget to support that. But that has been gradually corrected, at least in the past few years on that when I'm here. So when we do the budget there, if there's a new facility get opened up, etc. there, we try to factor in those new personnel needed, their maintenance operating costs related to that. sometimes still not 100% what they were asking for, but we try to make it work on that. But that's like more for the new ones. They're finished. Historical one, they are still not where they need to be. But again, every year we have the funding constraint. You cannot play catch up in 1 year. So.
Right. Well, it concerned me a little bit when we asked the question when the community college presented about the incremental staffing costs associated with the new math and science building, and it was kind of brushed off as if there weren't very many incremental costs associated with that. And obviously, if you add 50 or 60,000 square feet of structure on your campus, there's going to be some pretty consequential changes in your budget associated with that addition. So that's the gist of my question. It doesn't seem clear to me, at least, that this is being done in a systematic way to help understand what our pressures are going to be going forward.
Right. That's a really good point. We really have been pushing in exactly the same direction you've talked. At least the last few years, I have been pushing for that. And you're seeing more information even in the capital budget book there. The different capital budget there. There's a section talk about operating budget impact. That's beyond the debt service. That's operating maintenance. To
Right.
this extent possible, we encourage and we push people to put in. Most our own agencies end up doing that now, but I couldn't speak for other entities at this point.
Todd, maybe we can add that as an additional recommendation, that there's a some sort of some work done to quantify that from a countywide standpoint on the projects that are funded.
Yeah, and I mean, it obviously, when you're replacing the jail, there probably aren't a whole lot of incremental expenses. In fact, operating expenses might go down because you're not trying to operate a decrepit building. But when you're adding square footage, then you're adding operating costs.
Yeah, but and maybe I'm wrong, and if somebody from the college is on there, I think that building is not full add, it's replaced too, right? So it's not like they're going to fill it up with all new things. It's moving people around too. So, but I could be wrong.
But yeah, but
This
they're not knocking anything down. So
This is Glenn Coleman from the college. We are we're demolishing the current structure and building a new structure, but you are correct. It is an additional amount in square footage, and we have looked at that in our projection. So I should have corrected myself when I said that. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll go back to, we have 75 first and second, since those were the first ones. And I don't know how to do this with everybody, their camera off. Does people want to put something in the chat for me to write down, and then I will tabulate? Or do you me just say if I don't hear any nays, then it's passed? Holly?
I think either way is fine there. Just want so far as we have a record.
Yeah.
Steve, I think it needs to be an affirmative vote, not a, hey, if you don't say no, you're saying yes.
I know. So I'm looking at the chat, what people are putting in there.
Can everybody maybe just put in chat box? That way kind of.
Yeah.
Easy.
Dr. Clinch, you're just
Richard, my man.
I quit. I resigned my position on the committee. The request was a yay or a nay for 75.
Oh.
And now I'm getting 65 and
Sorry.
80 and maybe that's on me. That's on me, not on you. That's on me. Not being clear.
I think this works, Steve. Just have everybody throw out a,
Yeah, and I'll just take
throw out
whatever's the
throw out a
highest,
number.
whatever the
Yeah.
highest vote gets.
Instead of a yay, nay, just throw out a number.
Yeah. Well, given the number of people who are voting, I think 75 is the number. So, and then everybody will have a chance to vote on the report. So, very good. Okay, so I think we've covered everything except for additional recommendations. And I want to open up for the committee. These are I just left things in from previous ones. These are not any that I'm recommending. I was just showing what we've talked about in the previous one. I did say in here that, with MOE, with reduced enrollment, what will be the impact of the blueprint? And I don't know that anybody today will know that. We were told by the school system we won't know any of that real impact until June. So I think there should be some language in there just being, we just need to be cautious, do what we need to do, which is what's required of us, and make sure we don't do something that's more than required of us that's going to set us up for some sort of failure down the road.
Can I jump in on that real quick, Steve? I haven't spent a lot of time with it, but I did do a quick review of the State Department of Legislative Services county by county impact report. And that report, there's a chart in there that actually shows Howard County, according to their estimates, having to spend less under the blueprint than it does under MOE. Yeah, that was my reaction too.
We were told we're going to spend $100 million more.
Uh-huh.
Well, I can speak to that.
And I think a lot of that may have been, we have to spend more because if we hold all other spending equal and we have to get everybody up to a starting salary of 60, it's going to cost $100 million more. But that's not what Legislative Services was reviewing. They were reviewing what's actually required as opposed to, holding.
Well, maybe that's just what we talked about, which is what's required this year versus what's required over the next few years. But Jen, you want to go ahead and comment on that?
Yeah.
Right. So one of the reasons those numbers looked like they were less is because it developed a new funding formula. And we're already we're already above that funding formula, which sets the baseline that MOE cannot fall below. That being said, MOE is also something that you cannot fund less than you have in previous years. So
No, I think we all understand that. I think if you're reading what's on the screen, that was just, are we going to continue to fund above, knowing that we're going to have to spend all this extra money for blueprint? But
right, but in terms of looking at what what Legislative Services says needs funded, we need to make sure that that's not misunderstood, that we can't actually drop just because we're already above MOE calculations based on Legislative Services.
Got it. Okay.
Right. And Steve, that's an important thing for us to think about as we go forward, because, we had the discussion about the revenue projection, and obviously, revenue projection affects spending in the budgetary process. And to the point, a lot of people's points, I didn't jump in because everybody, I think, hit it pretty well, that if we go with that higher number and we do expenditures based on that higher number, this is one of the areas where if we go too high up and set a baseline at a certain point, it could bite us later when the corrections that, Richard and everybody else has been talking about kick in. So definitely a discussion worth having, not an unimportant number there, because that number truly does set the table going forward, and you don't want to set the legs too high on that table. Just thought.
No. I think we can say something about that in there just to make sure we're doing what we need to do. Obviously, we need to do what we need to do. I mean, it's as simple as that. I think I heard the superintendent say law about 12 times in his presentation. So
I think it was in all caps too, Steve, wasn't it?
Okay. Are there any other conversations around additional recommendations from the committee based on the presentations that were done this year, or anything else that people are aware of that's happening?
Hi, this is Khalida. I had a question about the recordation tax. Is that something that we're going to consider re-upping? The county council, I believe, voted down increasing their recordation tax, and I think it would be helpful, because I think in the discussion they did discuss monies that were just left on the table. And I think it's, especially with what the housing market has been, I think it's important to highlight what a huge mistake it was not to increase the recordation tax. So
We had something in here a few years ago where we were recommending that kind of all those fees get looked at, because to make sure we're within market for everywhere else where we were still below market for some other jurisdictions.
yeah.
Yeah, Steve, I was going to ask about that because I know in the past, and I didn't know if this was the one session that I missed and have not listened to the recording, but I know in the past, one thing we did is we looked at all of those, transfer tax, recordation, the whole 9 yards versus market. And if I remember the last time I sat in on this group a couple of years ago, we were actually, I think we were in line on that number. It was the transfer tax where we had some wiggle room to stay within basically, it was the overall, what do our closing costs look like versus other jurisdictions? And I don't know that we had room there. I thought we had room on the transfer tax. That's what we kept talking about, raising it 25 basis points, and we'd still be in line overall in terms of closing costs. That I don't know if we, like I said, I missed the meeting. I don't know if we looked at it in that meeting. If we didn't,
I forget what happened with that. What happened with
I think that's
transfer
an
tax?
important one to look at.
Yeah, I can update everybody or refresh memory on what happened. So first, regarding the county council actions or county actions in general, last few years there's two major legislation that I guess increased the rate. One is the school surcharge. There's a legislation passed there that actually did a phase-in of school surcharge rate increase every year in a 3-year period of time, raised with some quite a bit actually in a 3-year period of time there. So this is the last year for the phasing, then tied to inflation, I think. So that's one change happened, and that actually are boosting these designated sources for school capital project there. It's more down the road because there's still a lot of grandfathering, etc. going on, but down the road that will provide a lot of support to capital project of the school system. And the second is the transfer tax. Transfer tax was raised about a year ago at that point. So that was designated to different pieces. That's capital budget for our school system, for recreational parks, or for fire stations, as well as agriculture. And there's agriculture. Let me take it back. That one is not increased. So the rate gets spread to other things, and then community renew fund, that's for housing. So those 4 pieces there get a bump from that new tax rate.
It did get increased last year or 2 years ago.
Yeah. So that
they just didn't do what we had recommended for years, and just take that entire increase and dump it in one area. But to Holly's point, it sounds like they made that up with the surcharge. But I guess the question, Holly, is can we take a fresh look at all of those fees and rates and compare it to market? Because I think, when I hear the council say we left money on the table, yeah, you can do whatever you want to, but if we price ourselves out of the market versus other jurisdictions, you're putting in an increase you're never going to see, right?
Yeah, that actually can be included in this year's recommendations. But the county actually is in the middle of doing some kind of RFP to get contractor to study all the fees on that. I saw like a draft the other day about the RFP on that there. So there's a procurement going on there. Try to have a contract to do that kind of comprehensive study. We're more like just down to the details for that. Okay. But to your point, we are moving in that direction, but it's certainly fine for the committee to put that in the recommendation.
Holly, could you speak to the recordation tax? This is Joan.
Oh, recordation tax, it's 2 years ago. It's actually the calendar year when the pandemic started. That's a time that in the executive proposed budget, there was a assumption of the tax rate increase, and I think there was a legislative the legislation introduced by 2 council members, I believe, that was proposing a recordation tax increase that's going to raise, again, depending on how it gets structured, because different county do it different way. It's estimated to raise quite a bit of money. That was voted down, so that didn't get passed there. But that's what happened that year.
But it might be wise for us to include some mention of that, and particularly if there's a procurement process going on, just to lend support to increasing that recordation tax, because it would have brought in a significant amount of income, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure, given the amount of sales that happened.
Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you.
Got it. Along those same lines.
Real quickly, the recordation tax was estimated to bring in about 20 million.
Based on the recommended design at that point, right? Because it all depends on how you.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
In
Thanks,
today's
Greg.
market, it might be even a little bit more than that. But at that point, that was projected. Yeah.
Right.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that was the estimate at that time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I know and you're right, Holly, I think that would be an important thing to look at, because I know, for example, when we looked at it previously, we also noted that, we were talking about rebalancing the allocations within the transfer tax because for example, the ag land
Yeah, Steve,
preservation.
that got shut down.
Really?
Oh yeah, there was no reallocating of it. I think that the compromise was not put any more of the increase into the ag tax.
Right.
Okay.
And the reason is because the model was showing that at least for the next several years, there's still historical debt to pay out of it. So
Got
you
it.
can't just deplete it because there's historical debt there.
But there will be something potentially to do in a few years with that, Steve.
Right. Down the road, I think there will be opportunities.
Yes, I know I was tracking that way in the out years, certainly not immediately, but I know we thought about it. But okay, sorry, still catching up.
No worries.
If I can jump in just 1 second, I think it's important to understand what the numbers really mean in the real world. Like, for instance, the school surcharge, when it goes to 7%, the way the county calculates square footage, a fairly basic 2,500 square foot house, maybe 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, is not 2,500 square feet when it comes to calculating the school surcharge. It also includes the basement, includes the garage, it includes covered porches, anything under roof. So all of a sudden you take a very modest 2,500 square foot house and it's assessed at more like 36 or 3,800 square feet for school surcharge purposes, and you take 7% of that, all of a sudden you've got $25,000 of school surcharge being levied on new house construction. So it has a big impact on buyers of newly built homes in the county.
Understood, Todd. I've always been a bigger proponent of transfer tax and recordation tax being a place to get that, because that impacts everybody. And your populations are driving from resales more than they are from new. Okay. Any other
clarification between transfer tax and recordation tax? So transfer tax it's going to capital projects, whereas recordation tax is going into the general fund.
Yep.
So everybody knows.
No, I understand that, Craig. I'm just saying,
Okay.
I think that's where you take care, because it spreads it across everything and you have impact from everything, not just from new.
Right. Just wanted to
And I
make
think
sure.
it's easy to say, oh, our schools are being completely impacted by new home sales and new community growth, when resales have just as much impact to schools as that. So
sure.
I mean, I sold my house last year, which had 2 kids moved out of the school system, 4 more moved in the community in my old house, and they're now in the school system. So that had a net +2 to the school system for a resale. Anyway, okay. Any other recommendations for the report?
Expanding the rainy day fund or increasing the contributions to it.
Okay. What percentage what's our, and I know we have this conversation every time and we did go over it, but that's the whole thing where we have
10% currently.
10%. Okay. I thought it was 7%. Okay. 10%. Okay.
We have rainy day fund charter mandates, but also 3% policy reserve set aside. So that was now combined is 10%.
Okay. So it is 7 and then 3 is 10. Got it.
Right.
Okay. But no reason we can't have more sitting there for good stewardship of the county.
That would be the preference, yes.
So for clarification, there are people that are recommending that the rainy day fund have more than 10%.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
But
clarification on that one, the official rainy day fund is only 7%, and that's more of a committed amount of fund, whereas the policy reserve is 3%, and that is not really a committed amount. It's not rainy day fund per se. It's a
just
lot.
a little excess that we're keeping aside.
There's a lot less restrictions on that.
Yeah.
It can be
And I
used
think
a lot.
that's what we're talking about. We're not saying increase the mandated 7%. We're just saying
Okay.
have a little bit more savings.
Okay, I just want to make sure that everybody was understanding that.
Yes, Craig, you clarify that for us every year. I appreciate it because it is not as clear as everybody would want it to be.
Right.
Jen, do you not agree? Do you not agree with having more money in reserves?
Well, I want to know what industry best practices are, because if standards.
Is with us, finance directors with us.
Yeah,
I think really where it's coming from, if we look at, and they can answer that question first, but we look at it, we go, if we have a $70 million increase in revenue, I think with the committee, what I'm hearing, and maybe Josh, you can clarify, is we don't need to spend all 70 million just in case. What if next year is a little less? I think that's really what it's coming from. But Holly and Craig, you can comment on what other jurisdictions are doing, and Josh, you can clarify if I'm kind of picking up what you're saying.
No, that's exactly it, Steve.
Yeah, the industry standard is 15% minimum, up to 30, but we've always been below that. And
oh, really?
yes.
Wow, 15?
Other AAA.
Yes, 15% minimum.
And we get away with that with our AAA because of our base, our assessable base?
Actually, because of our fiscal policies.
Okay.
Which budget does well all the time. If there's a revenue shortfall, we have freezing of positions, vacant positions, reduction of spending in county government. But what they've advised is that is not always going to be possible every time without impacting services.
Gotcha. So we're well below kind of our peers who are AAA rated right now.
Yes.
And we get by with that because we're willing to, like we did a few years ago, basically, shut down growth in the middle of the year when we look at it and say, hey, receipts aren't coming in where we thought they were.
Fiscal discipline.
Okay.
Has that shown up on reports like that as a recommendation or corrective action or observation or something of that nature that we should try to get there?
I think our attempt was starting the policy reserve of 3% because I think we're trying to take baby steps because we know the county has numerous needs and we are trying to gradually build it up.
So 15% would be like $160 million?
Yes.
Okay. So we're like 50, 60 million short.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. All right. Very good.
And just to explain too is that we equally have the unassigned fund balance. So that is equally there, but of course, like Craig mentioned, that is available during the budget process almost immediately. And that's the first bucket that Harley goes to when we're having serious needs, if the recurring revenue will cover everything.
So would we be able to, and there's a question. So that 218 million, $220 million in assigned fund balance, which Craig clarified for us was not really assigned in an approval, but just assigned as in we're going to use this. We could get ourselves to 15% by not doing certain things that we're planning to do.
I think that conceptually is correct, but the component is really even it's called assigned, is really have different level of restriction because there are some part is in FY22 approved budget. So in other words, it's
got it. Okay. How
There's
much was an approved budget?
There's also PO that's already purchase agreement there. So that's already basic obligated there. And there are also rainy day fund annual increase that's also assigned there. But there are other pieces there, like we mentioned the other day, some pay-go set aside to support capital project for road resurfacing, for school system renovation. Those allocated for next several years. Technically speaking, those are flexible, but that's a strong intention that what it's for, but it's not until it's get approved in the annual budget. That's not the final and not set stone.
Okay, so let me ask this question. Is there you're saying growing the fund balance was assigned. Is there a plan in place to get us to 15%?
Oh, policy is, because we're not that aggressive. It took us 5 years. It's already accelerated the schedule to get
us to the 10%.
policy. Yeah. So we have,
well, maybe the recommendation from the committee can be put together a plan, and what the time frame would be to get us to 15%, to be more in line with our rating, and not have to, hope that everybody's comfortable with our fiscal discipline to keep our rating.
I have a brief clarification question. What did you say was the unassigned fund balance? What is the assigned fund balance amounts?
There was a slide on that, Holly. Do you have that readily available? Or Rafu, do you have that readily available to pull up and show?
If you might have that.
Available, but I do have it in our annual financial report, which is on page 77. Is actually $24 million, 24.5
for
in
unassigned.
the general fund, in unassigned fund balance. Unassigned, which is what that means is it hasn't been spoken for yet, and it will be spoken for during the budget process.
Well, no, I know, I appreciate that, but I think, and you can go deeper than this. You're talking about we're talking about $220 million of assigned that is spoken for. And I think she was asking for the breakdown of that 220 million.
Oh, I definitely can give you.
That's in the page that you just talked about.
Page 77 of the CAFA. It actually aligns, details all of them out. $60 million for capital projects, for road resurfacing, Ellicott City Safe and Sound, and etc. FY22 budget one-time initiatives, $9.7 million.
That's approved.
FY22 budget PAYGO, contributed to capital projects, $30 million. HCPSS one-time initiatives, as the schools, $10 million. School systemic innovation, one time, $30 million. Housing, $10 million. Pandemic and economic assistance, $10 million. Policy reserve, 33.3. Then, of course, the procurement purchase orders that we have is 21.7 or $21.8 million. And subsequent budget stabilization, which we set is aside as assigned before it goes into the rainy day fund, actually is 3.3. That is the breakdown of the $218 million.
Okay.
Thank you, Rafi.
Thank you.
So again, out of that number, there's really only the purchase commitments that has already been approved in prior budgets. So this is the plan of
also the FY22 approved the PAYGO, approved the capital and operating. That's also in council approved the budget. So that you need to count that as well.
And this the subsequent for rainy days.
I don't want to get into a discussion between who approved what and to whom and when. If the authority lies within whomever it lies to, like a PAYGO, and it's already been awarded but yet not funded, but the authority is there to do it, then it's spent in my mind. So that we could point fingers all day long, but basically, you just gave us a breakdown of the 220 million. And I think Josh's recommendation is, put more money in rainy day. I think maybe a more clear way to say that is develop a plan to get us to where our peers are who are AAA rated, which is 15%, so that we're not sitting here, hoping every year, we're going to get our AAA rating and continue that, because, and we've talked about that before, is the AAA rating worth what we're spending for it? But I don't think anybody around here wants to be the one who gets through that dam. So, all right, we have like 5 minutes left for the meeting. Does anybody have any other recommendations that they would want to put into the committee? And just because these recommendations are here and we're going to go through them doesn't mean that we're not going to have more time to talk about them. We will. I'll make sure that we get this report out to everybody as quickly as possible. And I would appreciate, given the virtual nature of this, if people are willing to give me written responses back ahead of the meeting so that we can really talk about it, with comments and suggestions on the report. I don't want anybody to feel like they're not included in putting together a report. I've just never been able to successfully put together a 15-page document with 30 people in the room doing it. So
I had a comment regarding operating that has not been brought up specifically, but has been alluded to by several comments this morning. It does seem to me that with the minimum wage increase, and there's another 12% slated this fiscal year, and then another, I believe it's 13% will hit next year. And I feel every single presentation we heard, staffing was a challenge. It was alluded to about the tie with the capital investment as well. And it seems to me that this committee's role is to at least point out that with the combination of staff costs increasing and obviously wage compression impacts tied to the ability to service deliver, which from what I could tell from the presentation is also built largely on a lot of nonprofit partners. When we're unclear and we're not in charge of forecasting how consumer behavior and need will go up, that really seems to be a tenuous sticking point that could be a problem for Howard County as we evolve. And I think just the idea of at least acknowledging that the staffing cost is both increasing, but the ability to be competitive to retain staff and to ultimately deliver the services is, at least to take away from the presentations for me, was it's a point of concern and a potential point of weakness.
I don't think I could have said it more elegantly. That's a great way of saying it, because the model for the community, especially for the community safety net in Howard County, the way that it's done versus the way that it's funded can create that kind of push-pull that you're talking about, and it could create issues for us if we're not paying attention to it. So I think absolutely we should say something about that. Right, Joan?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting here. Absolutely. And I think we need to look at the funding of those CSP grants, which have been level. There needs to be a significant increase. We are losing staff, direct care staff, leadership management. And if we can't offer more competitive salaries and benefits, we're going to have difficulty delivering services. And there is still, despite what we look at with income, there are still significant need in the county related to the pandemic that will continue. So yeah, thank you, Lakey.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. Anything else anybody wants to add? Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for the discussion today. I thought it was a very lively, very good discussion, very involved with the committee. I appreciate it. And we will work to get something put together and get it out to you as quickly as possible for review so we can have further discussion. So Thursday's meeting, we'll use that for report writing I'll ask a few people to join me for that. And then on, Holly, do we have a meeting scheduled for next week?
We haven't. We don't
Okay,
have
I'm gonna
a big group meeting.
Yeah, so I'll talk to that group on Thursday, and then we'll come back to everybody with when we think we'll get a report delivered. I'd like to have a meeting before the final vote on the 24th with everybody so we can have a discussion over the report and make any changes before we vote on the final one. So I appreciate everybody's flexibility as we come down to the line. I will say what I will always say is that this would be a lot easier of a process if we had more time. And I would appreciate that that those who are scheduling this and putting together this group, that they think of giving this team more time, because it is a very it's a very good team of people who work on this, and anyway, I just think, you know, it's all these challenges, we're kind of squeezing them into 2 months, and that's kind of hard to do. So, all right, everybody have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Steve, thanks, Holly.
Dutch.